Levi Brackman here with Truth, Jewish Wisdom for today. Thank you so much for joining. Today I'm going to do something different than the regular Torah portion. I'm going to talk about Tu B'Av, the 15th day of the month of Av, which is also known as Chag Ha'ava, the festival of love. And I'm going to talk about engagements in general, especially to celebrate the engagement of my son, Dovi, to Rivkah Steinberg. Mazel Tov to Dovi and Rivkah on your engagement. The engagement party is this coming Sunday, and we're looking very much forward to celebrating this major milestone in the lives of Dovi and Rivkah, as well as in the lives of myself and my wife, Shandi, because this is our first son who's getting engaged. We're very excited about it, and therefore I'm going to dedicate this episode of the podcast to Dovi and Rivkah. So I'm going to start off talking about the 15th of the month of Av, and it says in the Talmud, Tractate Ta'anit 26b, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said, Lo hayu yomim tovim liYisrael kechamish asa b'Av u'chiyam HaKippurim. There were no days as joyous for the Jewish people as the 15th of Av and as Yom Kippur. Why? Because Shebehen b'nois Yerushalayim yotzos b'chli loven she'ulin. Shloi levaish es misha ein loi, kolat kelim tunin tvila. Because on these days, the daughters of Jerusalem would go out in white clothes, which were borrowed, so as not to embarrass those who do not have any of their own garments, and all the garments required immersion. Ovnois Yerushalayim yotzos v'cholos bakramim, and the daughters of Jerusalem would go out and would dance in the vineyards. And what would they say? Bachur, young man. Please lift up your eyes and see what you choose for yourself. Do not set your eyes towards beauty. But you should look at family. Sheker akin v'hevel hayofi, isha yiras Hashem hisis halal. And it quotes the Proverbs 31:30, which says, Grace is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. V'omer, and further it says, Tanu la mi pri yodea, v'halaluha b'sh'arim ma'aseha. Give her the fruit of your hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. So this is what happened on the 15th of Av, and now every single year on the 15th of Av, this becomes a major holiday for the Jewish people, to the degree where the Talmud says that it was such a big holiday that it was similar in stature to Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, the holiest day of the year. Because this is the time when the young women of Jerusalem would go out into the vineyards and they would meet their potential grooms. And this was a very joyous time in the life of the people of Israel who lived in the land at that time. Modern day Israel, Tu B'Av is like the Valentine's Day of the Jewish state, and it's called Chag Ha'ava. It's a time when people show specific focus on their romantic relationships. So this is the relevance of the 15th day of Av to the Jewish people in the Jewish calendar. With regards to the idea of people getting engaged and the engagement parties that took place, this is how young men and women would meet back in those days. And then they would get engaged and they would celebrate their engagement parties. So what was an engagement party back then? In Judaism, there are two parts to a marriage. The first part is called Erusin, and the second part is called Nisuin. Erusin is where the man gives something of value to the woman and says, with this thing that I give you of value, I make an acquisition in a sense. And the acquisition here is the exclusive rights to this intimate relationship with the woman. That's what he's acquiring. And in return for this which I give you, and often it's a ring or something else of value, this woman then gives herself over and sanctifies herself. She's mekadesh herself to the man, and they are now married. And then there's a second part, is when the man actually brings the woman into his home, and that is called Nisuin. So Erusin and Nisuin. And those two parts today happen at once under the chuppah. So the groom gives the woman the ring under the chuppah, and then the same time the woman is under the chuppah, and the chuppah is symbolic of the house of the groom, and that's him bringing his wife into his house. So it's all done at one time in the modern marriage. But there are two parts to this. Then there's an additional part to the marriage process, and that is called the tanoim, or that means the conditions. And they are a series of documents signed by the two sides and by witnesses, which says that both sides are going to contribute these various different things to ensure that the wedding actually takes place. Different gifts that are given from the bride to the groom and from the groom to the bride, etc., etc. And these obligations are undertaken by the mechotanim, by the families of both sides. There are certain customs within Judaism that as soon as the bride and groom decide that they're going to get engaged, they then convene a engagement party. Some people call it a Sudas Erusin. That's not technically the correct term because, as we mentioned, Erusin is part of the wedding ceremony itself. But it's certainly some kind of party, engagement party that takes place. Some people call it a Vaart. A Vaart is the Yiddish term for word. Some people call it a l'chaim. Some people just call it an engagement party. But whatever it is, they sit down together and they make commitments to each other that they're actually going to get married at such and such a date. And as part of those commitments, they often will sign these documents called the tanoim, the conditions surrounding the marriage. And there's a lot of laws regarding what happens if after you've signed these commitments, one of the sides break off the marriage. Then there are certain consequences to that. Now, many people today do not actually do the tanoim. The tanoim, these conditions and these documents are often done right before the wedding. So today in many communities, they're all bunched together. You have the tanoim, which is the signing of these documents, the conditions of the marriage. That's done right before the wedding, on the day of the wedding. Sometimes the day before, but often on the day of the wedding itself. And then sometimes it's done at the wedding itself. And then after that, you do, under the chuppah, you do the Erusin and the Nisuin at once. So often it's all done at once. Whereas once upon a time, this was done at least in two different time periods, often 12 months apart. But we still have an engagement party. And at the engagement party, the chassan and kala, the bride and the groom, commit to each other. And often it's also the families committing to each other as well. Now, what's really interesting is that this idea of a Vaart, a word, where does it come from? Well, there's in the Talmud, in Kiddushin, Tractate Kiddushin, Daf Tes Amud Aleph, page 9a, it quotes Rav Gidl, who says in the name of Rav, that as the couple gets engaged, the families make commitments to each other, and the father of one of them says, I'm going to give the bride such and such, and the father of the bride says, I'm going to give the groom such and such, and then they straight away get married. And this is one of these examples where there doesn't actually have to be what's called a Kenyan, an act of acquisition, because as soon as they get married, acquisition takes place, and now the father of the bride gives whatever he said he was going to give, and the father of the groom gives whatever he said he was going to give. And no actual acquisition is needed. Rather, this acquisition takes place by way of mouth alone. So just by making a verbal commitment, that's how the acquisition takes place. Now, Rashi explains that really what's going on here is that there's no real acquisition taking place, truthfully. Rather, the father or the families of both the bride and the groom both have this enjoyment or pleasure from the fact that the children are getting married to each other, and from the fact that they have this pleasure, that is good enough for there to be an acquisition. And you don't actually have to have an additional acquisition which can take place in order to ensure the commitment of these funds or of these gifts on behalf of the father of the bride or on behalf of the father of the groom. Now, there are various types of acquisitions or acts of acquisition that can take place. And one of the customs about an act of acquisition which takes place during the ceremony where these conditional documents are signed is something called a Kenyan Suddar. Kenyan Suddar is this really interesting type of acquisition that took place in ancient Israel. It's found initially in the book of Ruth, but it's found all the way throughout the Talmud. It's called a Kenyan Suddar, or otherwise called a Kenyan Chalifin. A Kenyan Chalifin means when someone exchanges one thing for another. So, if, for example, I would like to buy something of even exchange with the other person, we can just exchange it with each other, and by the act of exchange, that is an act of acquisition, and now I've acquired it. By extension, there's another concept which is, what if I want to acquire something? I can actually use something as an exchange as a symbol of the thing I'm acquiring. So I can use a Suddar, which means a handkerchief, and I can take a handkerchief and I can pick it up and say, I acquire this handkerchief. And by acquiring this handkerchief, I'm obligating myself to give someone else something else. The other person who's acquiring then also picks up the handkerchief, and by picking up the handkerchief, they are now acquiring that thing which the other person gave. So that's called the Kenyan Suddar. It's a kind of symbolic type of act of acquisition. By picking up the handkerchief, it's as if you are committing yourself to either give something and have the other person acquire it, or vice versa, the other person is giving and you're acquiring it. So that's called the Kenyan Suddar. So one of the things that takes place at the time of the Tanoim, when these conditional documents are signed in anticipation of the wedding, is that both sides will pick up this handkerchief and will do a Kenyan Suddar. And that Kenyan Suddar, that act of acquisition, is a commitment that one is actually going to do what one says in these conditional documents. But that doesn't say that in the Talmud. In the Talmud, it just says this is one of the things that can be spoken by mouth, verbally. And that's why it's called a Vaart, which in Yiddish means a word, because the word is given, and a word is good enough. Why is that? Because by the enjoyment and pleasure that the two sides are having, the fact that children are getting married, that's enough for a commitment in order to say that they're actually going to do what they said they were going to do. What's interesting, though, is if you look at the Vaart today, or the engagement party today, for most people, what is the actual thing that takes place? If in those communities which don't write the conditional documents at the time of the engagement party, and there are many which don't write them, it's all done right before the wedding. What do they do at the engagement party? What they do is they actually pick up the handkerchief, but not the parents of both sides pick up the handkerchief to make a commitment of what they're going to do on behalf of the wedding. Rather, it's the bride and the groom which pick up the handkerchief as an act of commitment to each other. So it becomes much more of a party of commitment, not between the two families which are committing to put on a wedding, but it's a commitment from the groom to the bride and the bride to the groom that they're committing to each other. They're going to get married to each other. So this really takes away the whole idea of calling the engagement party a Vaart, because it's not really a word anymore. It's actually an act of acquisition which is taking place. This commitment is taking place with an act of acquisition. And in general, there's a question about the act of acquisition, because the marriage itself, the Kiddushin which we spoke about, the Erusin which we spoke about, is where the groom actually gives something of value to the bride to acquire the romantic exclusivity of the bride. So that is an acquisition which takes place. And this is another acquisition. So some people might think that you could actually confuse one acquisition for the other. But the truth is that's already dealt with in the Talmud, in the third page of Kiddushin Daf Gimel, where it says that there are three ways in which a man can acquire a woman: kesef, shtar, and bia, with money, with a document, and through cohabitation. And the Gemara says, well, what does this exclude? And the Gemara answers, it excludes the ability to acquire through the acquisition of Kenyan Suddar, of the handkerchief. So it's impossible for an acquisition of marriage to take place with a handkerchief. So what is happening here with this acquisition where you're picking up the handkerchief? It's just kind of a commitment. As a matter of fact, the Truma Sadeshan and others say that this actually isn't a real acquisition, because you can't really acquire something through this. They're not really acquiring anything. It's just really an asmachta. It's just really something which they're saying, I'm not just giving my word, I'm doing something even stronger than my word. And it's a ritualized version of that. So they're picking up the handkerchief, in a sense, is to kind of ritualize this idea of giving one's word for it. Although others have a different opinion, which say that it's a bit like a person who is acquiring the body of another person for work. So by picking up this Kenyan Suddar, by picking up this handkerchief, really what's happening here, according to this opinion, is there is an acquisition. And the acquisition is that the man is acquiring the woman to do what? That she's saying, I'm actually going to be there. And they're both, in a sense, saying, we're going to do this work to actually get married. And that is the acquisition that is taking place. They're both committing to actually do the work of getting married, the husband and the wife, or the bride and the groom. But not everyone agrees with that. Most people say, actually, there's no acquisition taking place here at all. This is just a ritualized version of a commitment to make the commitment even stronger. Now, the question is, why does one need to do this? Why do the bride and groom need to do this? What, we don't trust their word? And also, it seems like from the Talmud that when you have the parents of both sides committing, you don't need any ritualistic Kenyan or acquisition taking place. The word is good enough. So why, for the bride and the groom, do you need this Kenyan Suddar, this ritualistic kind of giving of the word? So what's really interesting to me is that I saw in the Kovitz Shurim from Rabbi Chanan Wasserman at the end of Tractate Ksubos, where he talks about this a little bit, and he says that when both sides commit and say, I'm going to give such and such for the wedding, and the other side says, I'm going to give such and such for a wedding, and the Talmud says that there isn't needed anything more than just their words, because this is one of the things that can be acquired just with words, he says that there's not really an acquisition that takes place here. It's not what you would call joyous akin. There's not an acquisition which actually takes place here by the words. Rather, there's this thing that says that there's such pleasure they have for each other that there's something called an umdana demuchach, which means that there's circumstances which kind of proves this thing that they actually want this to happen. So if you have children, you're so excited by the fact that you've brought the children into this world, they've grown up, and now they've actually met their life partner. You're so excited about that you're willing to give whatever it is. It's a time of your life where you're saying, I'm willing to pay this. I'm excited about paying this. And there's umdana demuchach. There's this kind of circumstance which proves it, that since they both derive such pleasure from the fact that their kids are getting married, they actually want to give this money, and they're going to follow through, they're going to do it, and therefore it's as if it's actually happened. So therefore there's no need for anything additional to make that commitment, because they're committed. They're committed by virtue of the fact that they're so excited about the wedding itself. What about the chas and kala? What about the bride and the groom? Well, one might argue that the bride and groom, although they are very excited about getting married in general, how do we know they're excited about getting married to that person? How do you know they have a commitment to get married to this particular individual? When you're talking about the parents, well, the parents, they just want their kids to get married. They're excited about the marriage itself. But in regards to the bride and the groom, they have to be really excited about each other. And the fact that they said they got engaged, that's one thing. But we don't really know what's going on inside them. They just met each other not so long ago. They've known each other their whole life. So for them, the commitment needs to be more ritualized. Just them giving their word is not good enough. Now, in Judaism, the engagement ring, the ring usually which has a diamond on, is not given from the groom to the bride until the day of the wedding itself. It's usually given actually after the wedding in what's called the cheder yichud, which is the room which the bride and groom go into after the whole ceremony to be alone, which is part of the wedding ceremony itself. So that's when the engagement ring is given. So they don't get an engagement ring during the engagement period or right after they get engaged. So when the groom proposes, he doesn't propose with a engagement ring, because a ring is usually given as a symbolism of the acquisition of the exclusivity of the Kedushin itself. Now, if you think about it in general society, in order for there to be an engagement, the groom usually goes out and he spends a lot of money and a lot of effort in order to choose this engagement ring. Whereas in the Jewish tradition, that doesn't happen. So even in the regular society, it's not just a word which is given that the groom says, I'm going to get married. Will you marry me? And she says, yes, now they're engaged. No, something is actually given to each other as a commitment. Something to show a commitment is given, because it's not circumstance here that proves the fact that they're committed to each other. With parents, there is a circumstance which can prove the fact, in a sense, that they want this wedding to happen, and therefore they're committed to it because they want their kids to be happy and they want their kids to be married, and they're so excited about it that they are obviously committed to it. But bride and the groom, it can't just be a word. It needs to be something else that happens. And since the groom is not giving an engagement gift or an engagement ring of value at the engagement, something else has to happen, ritualized to show that they're actually committed. And what they do therefore is they make an acquisition which everyone would agree cannot ever possibly be an acquisition which leads to Kedushin, which leads to the actual marriage itself. Because you don't want to do something which could mean that they're actually married, because that ends up with all other kinds of problems. Now they're actually married. They didn't realize that they were actually getting married. Now they're married, and if they break it off, then they need a divorce, etc. So they want to do something which everyone admits, and no one's going to say this is actually a marriage. And we know from Kedushin, Daf Gimel, page 3, where it says that there's only 3 things that a person can use to get married with: kesev, money, shtar, document and bia, and cohabitation. And that comes to exclude chalifin. which is the Kenyan Suddar, which is what they do, the kind of acquisition which is done at the engagement party, where the bride picks up the handkerchief and the groom picks up the handkerchief, and that way they're making a commitment to each other, not just a verbal commitment, but a physical act of commitment, which that is like what happens in the secular world, where the groom gives a engagement ring, but there has to be something more than a word, and that's why I would argue at the engagement party, the bride and the groom, rather than the parents, make a commitment with this ritualistic act of a Kenyan Suddar. With this explanation, I would like to wish Dovi and Rivkah Mazel Tov. May they build an everlasting edifice. May they have a beautiful family in the future, and excited to have Rivkah as part of our family. And if anyone is around in New York City this coming Sunday, please reach out to me and let me know, and I'll tell you exactly where the L'chaim is going to be. Meanwhile, thank you so much for joining. This has been Levi Brackman with Truths, Jewish Wisdom for Today, Engagement Edition.